Hello, philosophers, mystics, and saints. I'm back with more from the Freud Jung correspondence, and I promise I will finish and stop soon for those of you who are waiting for different topics. I am probably going to finish this tonight, but I'm not sure because it's 7:19 and I usually put tech up at 5, but I had to go to the market and I had a Portuguese lesson today, and then I hadn't eaten all day, so I had to eat, and time has just gotten away from me, and I'd like to do this video. It'll probably be in two parts just because I haven't finished and there's more about Jung and Freud's breakup, which that's what this is about. Why did they break up? And I think you will be able to see, and I'm going to try to read through some of the passages in various letters, starting with the 14th of November, 1911. I think you'll see that it was in part ideological and part psychological. I think it was ideological because they disagreed on the libido. Freud wanted to connect it and make it solely sexual, and Jung wanted to make it more general, and we'll see what they exactly disagreed on. Now, we wouldn't think that a disagreement would be a problem. And, Freud does sort of say that, well, just because we disagree, don't worry. We've disagreed on things since the beginning of our relationship. But, maybe Freud also thought that, he would get back to agreeing with Freud. And I think alignment was so important because, and this gets into the psychological, that Freud really wanted a disciple. He wanted a protege, and Jung sort of stepped into that and insisted on it. And I think that was very sincere on Jung's part because, Jung is 20 years younger than Freud. Freud had, created this foundation, and Jung was just starting to figure out his own ideas and practices. And he was sort of enamored of Freud. And so I think they both kind of love bombed each other, and Jung, maybe if he had a deeper sense of self-awareness at this point and sense of self, he would have understood what an independent soul he was, that he was not a disciple, but he was a leader. Like there's Freudian psychoanalysis and there's Jungian psychoanalysis, right? Like they are both sort of the founders and leader of their own sort of theories and practices. And, both I think equally important and interesting. I think after reading about, the Spielern, Jung, Freud kind of encounter and situation, and then reading this correspondence between Freud and Jung, I have renewed my interest in reading Freud, and I've ordered more of his books. I have some of his books that I haven't read, and I was even looking for a class because I'm trying to look for a second class that I can take as a student at the university where I also teach religious studies at. And I was really hoping that there would be a class in the psychology department on maybe history of psychology, focusing on Freud. I would love to sort of read Freud in community. But alas, there was nothing on Freud or Jung, so I guess that's not what they're studying. So I think asking each other to be Jung asked Freud in 1908, think of me, please, as your son and you as the father. And he specifically said this in the context or in light of what happened between you and Fleiss. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but I think it was his name, Wilhelm Fleiss. They were similar ages, unlike Freud and Jung, and they had a correspondence, and it was very fruitful on both sides. And I think that I'm not quite sure exactly why they had a falling out, but I think maybe it had something to do with, Freud wanting to sort of have his own set of theories and for that to be psychoanalysis. And maybe he was afraid of Fleiss, like the sharing of ideas would mean that the property of those ideas would be possessed by both men. And maybe Freud was wanting to go at it alone. I actually just bought the correspondence between Freud and Fleiss, but I don't think Freud kept his letters, so it's really just the letters of Freud to Fleiss. And I think, in a sense, like Freud, if he had kept letters, there's some indication that he might have wanted them destroyed. And so, and I'm not, I say all this with the very little like exposure that I've had to just me kind of casually looking up information. So, let me know if that's totally like off, and I'll probably read and do videos, so we'll see soon. But Jung didn't, I think he had this idea that, well, he wanted a more sure kind of connection. He wanted to reassure Freud. And so, I think that Jung just quickly started to understand how different he was and that he didn't want to be a disciple, because being a disciple means that you do align with, the person that you're following pretty much 100%. Like you are carrying on their legacy. And so, there's a bit of self-erasure and self-denial. Now, it's not bad to be a disciple, but it would just mean that, your own ideas were absent or not as important as the ideas of the follower. And so, and then there's always this kind of back and forth between Jung kind of testing the waters and saying, like, I'm going to study mythology, I'm going to study mysticism. And, Freud knew that he was interested in that kind of thing. But I think both of them could have communicated more, and both of them could have maybe taken stock of, like, how much of their ideas about the other were based in fantasy rather than reality. Both Freud and Jung seem to be like sweeping under the rug certain potential misalignments. But, at some point, I think Jung maybe felt like he didn't need Freud as much. And he wanted to, not in a sense that Freud was, above or higher than him to some great degree. Jung was getting his own notoriety. He was going to America on his own, and he, could no longer deny his own beliefs. And, could they have made it work? Yes, but it would take effort on both sides. Freud to see that Jung was still an important friend, even if he couldn't be a disciple. And for Jung to maybe, and I hesitate saying this, I don't mean this in a negative way. I mean this in a very like neutral way. But Jung would have to be less selfish. I mean, I think that you see as well in the correspondence that Freud is often a bit disappointed about, Jung not writing him as much as Freud would like, and Jung is always saying, "Well, I'm busy. I have that. I need to work on my book. It's for the cause," and and it's not like Freud isn't busy, right? But Jung really, he really does only what he wants to do. And, would Jung have even had time for Freud? And when two people have been in this honeymoon relationship, this love bombing, like we're enmeshed, and it's almost got like some narcissistic kind of attributes, like, the, we can't be close unless we are in 100% alignment, which means Jung would be in alignment with Freud. And, um, they both talk a lot about us versus them. Like they are the team that's against the world. And that's, I'm not saying that either of them, like, I'm not like diagnosing anyone. I'm just saying that there are like in their dynamic, I see elements that are also in dynamics with narcissists. Um, and but I don't think, but it's not like an analogy exactly, because I don't think anyone is like the victim or anyone is the villain. Certainly, I think again they both had things that they wanted in the beginning, and Jung became more honest as he became more sure of himself and as he um, gained external validation, etc. I mean, we see Jung's selfishness with his relationship with Sabine Spielrein as soon as, his reputation was sort of threatened. He just like threw Sabine Spielrein like to the wolves, like there was, he was like, you misinterpreted, just my professional affection. And, when that wasn't the case at all, they had a very equal, reciprocal kind of emotional affair. And, how he knew that he was hurting Emma Jung with his polyamory, but he went ahead anyway. And again, I'm not judging that as necessarily a vice. People like Nietzsche or Ayn Rand would say, what else can you do? Follow your own sort of heart and as an individual. But I think that, the vice potential to it comes with the impact on others. And, can we have both? Can we charge ahead with what we want to do? But still, how can we be thoughtful and kind to other people? And so I think, in a sense, how it could have worked with Freud is that he just needed to communicate more and say, what is most important to me now is not necessarily relationships, but my work. And just be straightforward with that. And, he could say to Freud, but I would hate to see our relationship just fall to the wayside. And, if this was true, he could say, I still value, even if maybe it's more valuable now that we disagree because we can make each other better. I would love to still, have you as one of my closest confidants. But, I am the type of person that I might disappear for a while because I'm working on something else. And that, is more important than any relationship that I have. And Freud might say, well, if this was true for him, Freud might say, what I wanted was a disciple, and I realized that you are not a, the right person to be a disciple to anyone. Um, he might say, what I respected in you was your brilliance, but that is the very thing that makes you not a disciple. And what I still want and need is that. And so I will be finding someone to take the place that I thought you were taking. And, but I agree with you, that disagreeing will make each other stronger. And he has said that in a sense, like he's always ready for criticism and etc. So, that's just my take on it. It's kind of like the effort that anyone has to put into a relationship after it changes, after someone changes. Communication is important, honesty is important, and then, a commitment to putting in some kind of effort is important. It's like if, in 2025, I don't think this would be necessarily like appropriate or ethical, but if, say, a client and their therapist, they stopped therapy and they decided they wanted to be friends, they would have to talk about the transitioning of the dynamic and the roles, right? Like, because the person who was a therapist to this client doesn't want it to be one-sided. It can't be one-sided in friendship. So the client, the former client, has to understand that as a friend, like, you're going to have to listen to. Both people are going to have to be listened to. Both people are going to have to give advice. And sort of the asymmetrical element is going to have, both people are going to have to work on making sure that it transforms to something more equal. And I think that's hard to do. If there are people who have done it successfully, kudos to them, but that isn't like in terms of me being a professor and, my students. I know some professors have close relationships with their students after they have graduated, but that's just not something I'm interested in doing. I don't want to try to put the effort forth to try to figure out how to not see myself as the professor and them as the student. I don't want to find my friends in the classroom as much as I adore my students and love them and, very much enjoy having class with them for a semester. I'm also appreciative of, the time that it ends and then, they move on and I get a new group of students. And so, I think that like it just takes a lot of work, and that's what would have had to happen. And that, I guess, they didn't figure out how to do that. Okay, so that's kind of my introduction. So on the 14th of November, there are two things that I think are kind of interesting. One, Freud is writing Totem and Taboo, which gets into, him looking at religion and him looking at mythology. And so he's kind of entering into Carl Jung's realm. And so Jung is writing to Freud and says, the outlook for me is very gloomy. If you two get into the psychology of religion, you are a dangerous rival if one has to speak of rivalry. Yet I think it has to be this way, for a natural development cannot be halted, nor should one try to halt it. Our personal differences will make our work different. And I think that's interesting. Even if it seems like here Jung is accepting of it there's maybe like a little shadow trigger kind of coming up, a little bit of his worry. And this is the letter that he also says that he says, in my second part, and I think this is his work, Transformations of Libido or something. He says, in the second part, I have got down to a fundamental discussion of the libido theory. He says that passage in your Schreiber analysis where you ran into the libido problem, in parentheses, loss of libido equals loss of reality, end parentheses, is one of the points where our mental paths cross. So, he doesn't really say much more than that here. Emma Jung also has another letter that same day to Freud, but I'm going to skip that. And the next, and then I did read the Emma Jung letter of 24th of November, 1911, about her predicament. So that is something that is within the sequence. So on the 30th of November, 1911, and again, I'm just reading some passages that kind of start to track the beginning of the end. So Freud says to Jung, I have hit on a few objections to your method of dealing with mythology. And that's really it. And he says how he brought it up with Sabina Spielrein, because now they are sort of in conversation. And he also says, talking about the libido, I'm afraid there is a misunderstanding between us. The same sort of thing as when you once said in an article that to my way of thinking, libido is identical with any kind of desire. Whereas in reality, I hold very simply that there are two basic drives and that only the power behind the sexual drive can be termed libido. So Freud is like putting it out there, yes, libido is connected to the sexual drive. That is what I want to say. And I think this is, and he mentions a sort of misunderstanding. And I think that on Jung's part, to save the relationship, it's a willful misunderstanding. Like he wants to misunderstand. And then Jung writes back in December. He says, so far as possible, I shall take note of your objections to my method of dealing with mythology. I should be grateful for some detailed remarks so that I can turn your criticism to account in my second part. So not that he's going to agree with Freud, but maybe use it as a counter argument is how I'm reading that. He says, as for the libido problem, I must confess that your remark in the Schreiber analysis has set up some booming reverberations. This remark, or rather the doubt expressed therein, has resuscitated all the difficulties that have beset me throughout the years in my attempt to apply the libido theory. The loss of to his, I forget what he calls it, but I think it's about schizophrenia. Is it? Because it's abbreviated here. The loss of the reality function in this, what is it? I don't know if I can find it quickly, but it's what, Jung was working on, DP, but I can't quite, I'm not going to find it. Hold on, I'll be back. Okay, yes, I found it. It's dementia praecox, which yeah, so was an early psychiatric term for what we now call schizophrenia. Okay, so let me start again. The loss of the reality function in dementia praecox, is that right? Cannot be reduced to repression of libido, defined as sexual hunger. Not by me, at any rate. Your doubt shows me that in your eyes as well, the problem cannot be solved in this way. And I wonder if that's like an olive leaf, like a hope that that's true, that they're seeing eye to eye. I have now put together all the thoughts on the libido concept that have come to me over the years and devoted a chapter to them in my second part. I have got down to a fundamental discussion of the problem and arrived at a solution which I am afraid I cannot discuss in extenso here. The essential point is that I try to replace the descriptive concept of libido by a generic one. So, Freud's being very specific, and then now Jung's being very specific. He wants to make libido generic as an energy, which is, in a sense, how I think they talk about it. Where I'm putting my libido. I don't think they really mean anything sexual by that. And so, still in December, Freud writes back, I am all in favor of your attacking the libido question, and I myself am expecting much light from your efforts. Often it seems I can go for a long while without feeling the need to clarify an obscure point, and then one day I am compelled to by the pressure of facts or by the influence of someone else's ideas. And so, I think Freud is saying here, no, this is great, because then that'll help me clarify so there's not really, neither of them are really sort of bowing down, which, they don't have to, right? They can have their own ideas, but is that then going to be detrimental to the relationship that they both had said that they wanted to be in? And then he talks about his work. He says, my study of totemism and other work are not going well. I have very little time, and to draw on books and reports is not at all the same as drawing on the richness of one's own experiences. He says, besides, my interest is diminished by the conviction that I am already in possession of the truths I am trying to prove. And he says, I was not cut out for inductive investigation. My whole makeup is intuitive. I get you, Freud. I sometimes just like to say what I think as well and not do a lot of research. And there's this really interesting point actually in this letter, but I don't think I'm going to read it right now. Just the first part of it, but he goes into his sort of objections of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve story in Genesis. He feels as if it's like a distortion. He says the myth of Genesis is a distortion devised by an apprentice priest who wove two independent sources into a single narrative. So, he just questions like that there are two trees, and it's really sort of interesting. But the beginning of it is, he says, you have asked for an example of my objections to the most obvious method of exploiting mythology, and I shall give you the example I used in the debate. And that's when he goes into, using a myth that Freud doesn't feel is in alignment with the sort of core mythological themes. And so I think that's interesting, that we can maybe say that, is he telling Jung that sometimes Jung exploits mythology? I don't really know. Freud once said that, I'm all for you trying to locate the libido, which Freud means is behind the sexual drive, in mythology. And, if Jung has a different definition of the libido, then that's really not furthering the Freudian cause, which I think Freud was really, that's what he was invested in. he says, there's this other part that I think is kind of interesting. He talks about this client that he has. He calls her Frau C. And I guess this is about Jung's kind of practice in kind of getting too involved with his patients. So I think I'm just going to mention it now. Frau C has told me all sorts of things about you and Pfister, if you can call the hints she drops telling. I gather that neither of you has yet acquired the necessary objectivity in your practice, that you still get involved, giving a good deal of yourselves and expecting the patient to give something in return. Permit me, speaking as the venerable old master, to say that this technique is invariably ill-advised and that it is best to remain reserved and purely receptive. We must never let our poor neurotics drive us crazy. I believe an article on counter-transference is sorely needed. Of course, we could not publish it. We should have to circulate copies among ourselves. And he says, if you really feel any resentment towards me, there is no need to use Frau C as an occasion for venting it. So there's just a little bit of biting back and forth. And Jung does have a reply. I guess Frau C is maybe telling Freud a little bit about what Jung really thinks about him but doesn't want to say. And Freud ends the letter by saying, the trouble with you younger men seems to be a lack of understanding and dealing with your father complexes. So, I don't know. Jung says, and this is January 1912, when he is replying to Freud, he says, I've waited a long time for Frau C to inform you, as arranged, about this awkward situation. It has been weighing on my mind. I don't know what she has told you. This is what happened. She asked me about her sister and came to see me. Then she put the crucial question. Sensing a trap, I evaded it as long as I could. I think he mentions that, I think he's saying something like, he told her that she shouldn't take too much time of Freud's or something, and so maybe that made her think that Jung had an idea of Freud, and I don't know, it was just a bit of gossip and rumors, etc. So Jung says, I would gladly have avoided it, I guess talking to her and telling her something that had to do with Freud. Had not my pity for her wretched condition seduced me into giving her the advantage, even at the risk of sending her off with a flea in her ear. And so he tries to explain that. And then there's another letter in January to Freud from Jung, and he says, as regards the countertransference, I am merely a little bit refractory and indulge in peculiar fantasies by ways of experiment. He says, I am fully convinced. Was that a Freudian slip? I am fully convinced that the patient must play the passive part, and that the analyst need never exhort anything by means of the countertransference. On the Christian principle, look what I've done for you, what will you do for me? For me, the cardinal rule is that the analyst himself must possess the freedom which the patient has to acquire in his turn. Otherwise, the analyst will either have to play possum or, as you say, be driven crazy. I think it is far more a question of our different ways of living than any disagreement in principle. So, what he means by that, the analyst has to possess freedom. So I guess, Freud is defending his involvement in his clients. and sort of his free expression of, his feelings that he might develop, including like countertransference feelings, because he thinks that is important because the client needs to see an expression of freedom and non-shaming of the self, non-repressing of the self. And then Freud says to Jung in one of his letters, he says, "What you write about the Frau C incident almost makes me feel sorry. If anything, you might modify your technique a little and show more reserve towards the patient. What the poor thing wants most is an intellectual flirtation that would enable her to forget her illness for a while." So I think that exchange is important because it's just showing how different their sort of techniques and approaches are. I would agree with Freud that Jung is doing something that would not be allowed in like 2026. Oh, it's not 2025 anymore. I think that Jung, though, maybe, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Like, he believes in what he's saying, but I think we're seeing him sort of dig his heels in to his own sort of ground. And there is, I guess, still Freud in the same letter, another sort of kind of criticism. And these are just coming up more in this time period than I had seen previously. He says, "It seems to me that your two recent contributions to psychoanalysis, both most significant, your demonstration of unconscious heredity in symbolism, which amounts to a demonstration of the existence of innate ideas, and Ferenczi's proofs of thought transference lead us far beyond the original limits of psychoanalysis, and that we should follow." He says that, he doesn't want to hold Ferenczi back. So I don't know exactly how to take that, but it sounds like, Jung does have this idea that archetypes and mythological symbols are inherited, and we have them, and that's what our collective unconscious is. And it seems like Freud is at least saying that he doesn't align with that, if what he aligns with is the original limits of psychoanalysis that he has set himself. So just a comment, in the end of January 1912, Jung writes Freud a letter. This is really just him mentioning his journey in mythology. He says, "I am overwhelmed with work and grappling with the endless proliferation of mythological fantasies. In order to master the overwhelming mass of material, I have to work unceasingly and am feeling intellectually drained." I think he's talking about this in light of like not wanting to deal with maybe some kind of scandal. There's like talk of victims of blackmail, etc. And so I think it just kind of shows like where Jung's libido is, and that will be a factor in sort of the Freud-Jung dynamic. He says, in February 1912, Jung says and writes to Freud, "A quick word to let you know I am still alive. I am having grisly fights with the Hydra of mythological fantasy, and not all its heads are cut off yet." And he talks about how Emma is helping him with etymology. And now there is, I think, well, maybe not yet. They get into like kind of a theoretical back and forth about a specific aspect of the libido, but not quite yet. What do I want to read here? Just an interesting statement of Freud's. "I should have been glad to see your name figure prominently in this journal and the Zentralblatt, but instead you hide behind your religious libidinal cloud." So kind of, just a little bit of a jab, I think, saying that Jung is kind of preoccupied and not being like collaborative, maybe, I don't know. He says, "I am myself am busy with the study of taboo." And I think I'll skip a couple of letters. Let's look at this one. On the 25th of February, 1912, Jung writing to Freud, "I think I am not wrong in suspecting that you rather resent my remissness as a correspondent. In this regard, my behavior is indeed a little irresponsible, as I have allowed all my libido to disappear into my work. On the other hand, I don't think you need have any apprehensions about my protracted and invisible sojourn in the religious libidinal cloud. I would willingly tell you what is going on up there if only I knew how to set it down in a letter. Essentially, it is an elaboration of all the problems that arise out of the mother incest libido, or rather the libido cathected mother imago, or imago. This time I have ventured to tackle the mother. So what it is keeping me hidden is the catabasis to the realm of the mothers. So going into, making a descent into the underworld, I guess. And, they're going to get into kind of this discussion, debate about incest. Jung is going to say that he doesn't think there was really ever any desire about this, but yet there was like a generalized anxiety that produced certain rules, and then maybe the rules created sort of a desire in very, I guess, particular situations, but he doesn't see it as universal or as like a real sort of sexual issue or problem. So this is going to be like different than Freud is talking about. But about the correspondence, Freud says to Jung, "What you say about my resentment of your tendency to neglect our correspondence warrants more thorough psychoanalytic elucidation. There can be no doubt that I was a demanding correspondent, nor can I deny that I awaited your letters with great impatience and answered them promptly. I disregarded your earlier signs of reluctance. This time it struck me as more serious. My suspicion was aroused by your refusal to inform me of the state of your health after the dog bite and by the Frau C episode. I took myself in hand and quickly turned off my excess libido. I was sorry to do so, yet glad to see how quickly I managed it. Since then, I have become undemanding and not to be feared." As we know, irresponsibility is not a concept compatible with depth psychology. But it would be a severe blow to all of us if you were to draw the libido you require for your work from the association. So I think this is interesting. It's kind of, sort of a sad aspect that Freud is basically saying, well, I see that, the quickness of correspondence on my part is not reciprocated, so, I just observed that and adjusted myself. But, it seems like a breaking away more than a getting close to each other. And Jung basically is just defending himself in his response letter to Freud. He says, if I have not played an active part in the Zentralblatt or Imago, it is simply because I am fully occupied with the Jahrbuch and also with my own work. He says, the work I am doing has demanded so much time and energy because when it finally appears in finished form, it will amount to a book of over 300 pages. He says, whenever I had anything important to communicate, I always have done so. I have not kept up a lively correspondence during these last weeks because I wanted, if possible, to write no letters at all, simply in order to gain time for my work. Or can it be that you mistrust me? Experience has shown how groundless this is. Of course, I have opinions which are not yours about the ultimate truths of psychoanalysis. Ooh. And then he quotes, and this is in March of 1912, and then he quotes Nietzsche, Zarathustra's, the book on Zarathustra. One repays a teacher badly if one remains only a pupil. I mean, they are really sort of having it out. This is Freud's response. Why so pensive when the situation is so simple? I have pointed out to you that the association cannot prosper when the president loses interest in it over a period of months. So a jab at Jung, the president, especially when he has so unreliable an assistant as our friend Rilken, because Jung has kind of blamed Rilken for a bit of the, neglect. And Freud is really saying, well, he's under you, so that's your issue. He says, otherwise we agree on everything. He says, the indestructible foundation of our personal relationship is our involvement in psychoanalysis. But on this foundation, it seemed tempting to build something finer through, though more liable, a reciprocal intimate friendship. Shouldn't we go on building? You speak of the need for intellectual independence and quote Nietzsche in support of your view. I am in full agreement, but if a third party were to read this passage, he would ask me when I had tried to tyrannize you intellectually, and I should have to say, I don't know, I don't believe I ever did. Still, if you want greater freedom from me, what can I do but give up my feeling of urgency about our relationship, occupy my unemployed libido elsewhere, and bide my time until you discover that you can tolerate greater intimacy. Oh, that's such a burn. Is Freud calling Jung avoidantly attached? I don't know. But I mean, Freud is clearly taking what Jung is saying to heart. And, or maybe, some of you might think he's misunderstanding Jung. I don't really think he is. I think Jung has maybe built up some resentment and Freud is reading it. And I think Freud is hurt, but what he's saying is quite mature and valid. If someone isn't giving you the attention and the communication that you were giving them and that you thought, they were sort of committed to, then, there's no point in yelling at that person or demanding that they change. It's just, you adjust yourself. right? So you maybe care less, you get another friend, you occupy your libido elsewhere, as Freud says. So also, he says, why, I repeat, should you be so pensive? Do you think I am looking for someone else capable of being at once my friend, my helper, and my heir, or that I expect to find another so soon? He says, rest assured of my effective cathexis and continue to think of me in friendship even when you do not write often. So, this is what I mean about, sort of this resistance or this misalignment kind of coming up. But then also there are statements on both sides about, sort of affirming the desire to be in some kind of relationship and also questioning what that might look like. But I really appreciate here this list of how Freud thinks of Jung as a friend, as a helper, and as an heir. And, it's valid if Jung doesn't want to be the heir anymore. His feelings have changed, his situation has changed. We might, see that slightly as opportunistic and problematic, that Jung was so ready to promise Freud his discipleship when, Jung was not confident and needed Freud. But now that Jung has his own, he's secure in his own like theories and ideas, and he has some, sort of fame, his own followers, that he kind of like drops Freud. I can understand if Freud feels that way. And if that is how it seems, but then also, can you really fault Jung for that? People evolve, and that's what happens when, you are in the position of Freud and you meet someone who is 20 years younger than you. And so you don't know how they will evolve. You don't know what they will become. And you have to maybe leave some room for some expectation that they are going to grow up and be their own person. And, separate from, if they really had started off as the father-son, then they sort of built in a future separation already, because isn't the whole idea of like maturing to break away from the father and to break away from the mother and not be so enmeshed and have your own path, move away, have your own adventures, live your own life, create your own family, right? There is a separation, but I think that that's where they went wrong. They wanted both the father-son relationship, and they wanted that to be eternal. And, we filter through various archetypes in our relationships, and sometimes that means that the relationship itself, gets a little unstable, and, that it dissolves. So, yeah, so, that is what's happening. So that was the 5th of March, 1912. They sort of keep talking about like Spielrein, since Spielrein is around Freud and her paper. They keep calling her like a little girl or something, but Mädchen maybe. And Lou Andreas Salome is also submitting. So they're not really talking about themselves. And the next letters in April, this is interesting. The 21st of April, 1912, Freud says, I am eagerly looking forward to your second libido paper with its new concept of the libido because I imagine that the, quote, Declaration of Independence you announced a while ago is expressed in it and may indeed have related to nothing else. You will see that I am quite capable of listening and accepting or of waiting until an idea becomes clear to me. So I think Freud has some wishful thinking here that, oh, Jung, you mustn't have meant that you want to be independent from the father as the son. You might have just been afraid that I would be cross with you, or punish you because you have this independent idea. So, yeah, so that's what Freud is offering us here. And then the sort of incest problem comes up for a few letters. Jung says, and I hope that, I'm not monetized, so I can't get demonetized, but I just hope this is not a bad word for me to say in a video. Maybe it doesn't matter if I'm not monetized, right? Okay. So he says, like you, I am absorbed in the incest problem, this is Jung, and have come to conclusions which show incest primarily as a fantasy problem. Originally, morality was simply a ceremony of atonement, a substitutive prohibition, so that the ethnic prohibition of incest may not mean biological incest at all, but merely the utilization of infantile incest material for the construction of the first prohibitions. And he says, I don't know whether I am expressing myself clearly, and I'm not completely sure I get all of it, but if it's not biological and it's a fantasy and it is, sort of a moral prohibition that is a ceremony of atonement, I think maybe sort of what I get out of it, and I still think I have to think about this because, I haven't read what Freud says about this. And so I think that would be a more helpful foundation if I did. But I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that he's saying kind of what I said before, that there was a need for rules so that people would feel like maybe ancient people would feel calm, that they you need sacrifice, you need rituals, so that I can say that I've done A, B, and C and now I'm safe, because there might be some sort of offense to the gods that I don't know about because I don't talk directly to the gods. Maybe only some people do. And kind of like in Greek mythology, the people were always trying to sacrifice, but they never knew the whims of the gods. It was hard to say from a human perspective what would offend the gods or who the gods would favor. So that's kind of a vulnerable situation. And so what humans would do to sort of give themselves a little peace is make up, I think. And this is where Jung, I think, is getting the sort of fantasy problem instead of a biological problem. He's saying that this was just one of the things that was brought up somehow and created, but I think Jung would have to say that's pretty unique and specific. Why that? But nevertheless, it's one of the rules and prohibitions that maybe would help people be peaceful. I don't know. So that's just what I'm maybe getting out of it. But there's a lot of this, but that's basically, Jung's thesis. He's saying that it's not biological. Because he says if it were, then the father-daughter pairing would have fallen under the prohibition much more readily than that between son-in-law and mother-in-law, for instance. He says that the tremendous role of the mother in mythology has a significance far outweighing the biological incest problem, a significance that amounts to pure fantasy. And then there's another letter of Jung, because he doesn't feel like he's expressed himself clearly. And so there's basically like another letter, and he's again saying that, it seems like the father-daughter relationship is excluded in this prohibition. So, that makes him question like real desires. He doesn't feel like there's real desires. He actually says that in riper years, on the other hand, when the son might really be a danger to the father, and laws were therefore needed to restrain him, the son no longer had any real incestuous desires for the mother, with her sagging belly and varicose veins. All right. I mean, I think that's interesting that they knew about varicose veins back then, but I guess it's not like a modern understanding of an issue. So, I won't read a lot of this, but he says, evidently, this is the last sentence in that paragraph, evidently the object of the prohibition is not to prevent incest, but to consolidate the family, or piety, or the social structure. So, here I think it's just another kind of example that Jung is giving, that he wants to take the focus off of the sexual. Because if it's more about relationship and, what does he say, social structure. So it's funny that Freud writes back in May 1912, saying, "It will surely come as no surprise to you that your conception of incest is still unclear to me." So, and I mean, I get it. It's kind of unclear to me as well. But he sort of says he has 3 observations to make. Number 1, many authors regard a primordial state of promiscuity as highly unlikely. Number 2, mother rights should not be confused with gynecocracy. I don't know how to say that. It seems likely that there have been father-sons at all times, because I think this was Jung mentioned that maybe in a matriarchal society, there were no father-sons. And then Jung writes back in May 1912, trying to be more clear. He says, as regards the question of incest, I am afraid of making a very paradoxical impression on you. I only venture to throw a bold conjecture into the discussion. The large amount of free-floating anxiety in primitive man, which led to the creation of taboo ceremonies in the widest sense, produced, among other things, the incest taboo as well, or rather the mother and father taboo. So he says, from this point, we must say that incest is forbidden not because it is desired, but because of the free-floating anxiety that, requires basically a ceremony of atonement. It's kind of like this, I guess, what people call Catholic guilt. You're worried that you're guilty of something, so even though you can't even say what you should be guilty of, you need some kind of ritual of atonement so you can feel better, be less anxious. I think that's an interesting idea. I mean, I haven't looked into any of that, but it's kind of interesting because a lot of the letters prior to this sort of beginning of the end sequence were very much like housekeeping. They were almost kind of letters I wanted to skim, because it was all about, did you schedule the hotels for the conference, or when is the date of the next Congress, or, it was very admin, housekeeping, kind of business oriented. And I think both of them mentioned that they didn't have time to write more theoretically to each other. So he says that it doesn't matter whether a sexual trauma, just as cum grano salis, it doesn't matter whether a sexual trauma really occurred or not, or was mere fantasy. It is psychologically quite immaterial whether an incest barrier really existed or not. So he says that it could be a fantasy, and that would create the same sort of need for a rule as if it were real. And so he is, leaning toward it wasn't a real desire. And so, he says the incest taboo is the symbol or vehicle of a far wider and special meaning which has little to do with real incest, as hysteria with the sexual trauma, the animal cult with the bestial tendency, and the temple with the stone, or better still, with the primitive dwelling from whose form it is derived. So Jung says, I hope I have expressed myself a bit more clearly this time. And Freud responds, May 1912, in the libido question, I finally see at what point your conception differs from mine. What I still fail to understand is why you have abandoned the older view and what other origin and motivation the prohibition of incest can have. He still, asks, well, why? Like, why this specific? And Jung is trying to say, it doesn't matter. It was just something that they thought of. It could have been anything, I think. But Freud says, naturally, I don't expect you to explain this difficult matter more fully in letters. I shall be patient until you publish your ideas on the subject. He says, I own to a strong antipathy toward your innovation. It has two sources. First, the regressive character of the innovation. I believe we have held up to now that anxiety originated in the prohibition of incest. Now you say, on the contrary, that the prohibition of incest originated in anxiety, like general anxiety, which is very similar to what was said before the days of psychoanalysis. And then he gives a dig saying that basically it sounds like Adler, and you don't want to sound like Adler, do you? So, secondly, because of a disastrous similarity to the theorem of Adler's, though I, of course, do not condemn all of Adler's inventions. And then he goes on to say what Adler has said. So Jung replies, and basically says, you're not taking me seriously. I have objective reasons that I think this, and you're saying that basically it's because of a complex or something, that it's regressive and similar to what people that we have, this guy Adler, that we have both condemned and criticized in the sort of us versus them rhetoric. So he says, Jung says, I am grieved to see what powerful effects you have mobilized for your counter-offensive against my suggestions. Since I think I have objective reasons on my side, I am forced to stand by my interpretation of this concept and see no way out of the dilemma. He says that the parallel with Adler is a bitter pill, but he swallows it without a murmur. He says, evidently, this is my fate. There's nothing to be done about it. But he can't, he can't, bow down. He says that I'm hard at work at my American lectures, and that's really interesting. When he goes to America, he comes back and tells Freud, hey, people really liked what I was doing, the changes that I'm making. And Freud tells him, well, that's not something to celebrate. So we'll get into that. The fact that you felt no need Oh, he says, I guess there was a time when Freud said he would be close to Jung but couldn't meet him. And says, the fact that you felt no need to see me during your visit must, I suppose, be attributed to your displeasure at my development of the libido theory. I hope we shall be able to come to an understanding on controversial points later on. It seems I shall have to go my own way for some time to come. But you know how obstinate we Swiss are. Um, so I should probably stop there. I have, a few more letters and everything. I thought I could do everything that I've read in one letter, but I should probably save it for another. But you see how, like, this just never really happened in the earlier letters. Like I said, they had sort of decided on they were going to be father son. They were going to be, leader, follower. Jung was going to be a disciple. And then they were just working. They were working. They were pointing out people who were not with them, and that was the bulk of the letters. But now I think Jung really wants, Jung is scared, but he's also adamant about Freud understanding where he is now. And I hope that you can see that their breakup is partly ideological, but it was based on sort of the ideological conditions that then those conditions are psychological. And all of this kind of going back and forth, like, you don't write enough, so I'm gonna like not care that you don't write. And Jung saying, you didn't visit me, so maybe you're mad at me. Yeah, I mean, I think we can see kind of how, like, where this is all going.